you hear about how cancer forces you to reevaluate your priorities. I feel like my priorities are pretty good. I have family and work, they're fine. I think the one thing I would say is that there's a value, particularly in the South Asian community, for humility, right? And if you're blessed with gifts, you don't want to like flout them. And I think I've taken that so much to heart that sometimes I take the things that I have for granted. And for me, one of those things is music. I've been a lifelong musician. I was a singer.
In Pemmisola.
Yeah, a long time ago, and then I did my own music for a little while, and um, I think realizing that I might lose that gift with a surgery for my thyroid made me realize that there were so many things that by not enjoying, I was doing myself a disservice. So I ended up, flying across the country to do karaoke with my pen masala buddies and they humor me. And I threw a birthday party, which I hadn't done for a long time. When I turned 40, I hadn't done that. And I realized that sometimes celebrating your gifts is like a thing that we should do, and it's not immodest.
I'm Simi Shaw, and welcome to South Asian Trailblazers. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Season 8 of South Asian Trailblazers. Today, we have a very special guest joining us on the show. Sandeep Acharya is the founder and CEO of Octave, a company that's reshaping the mental health care landscape by making exceptional care the standard. Under his leadership, Octave has partnered with major insurers to make high-quality, affordable therapy available to people across 23 states. Octave has been recognized as a LinkedIn top startup and among the best workplaces in not just the healthcare industry, but the entire country. Before founding Octave in 2018, Sandeep spent his career as an investor, operator, and consultant at Bain Capital and Insight. He then joined the leadership team at unmet, overseeing strategic initiatives, where he helped expand the company to more than 60 clinics in 8 cities before starting his own company. Sandeep earned his undergraduate degree from Wharton, so yes, he is a very special guest, and his MBA from HBS. Sandeep, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So I actually want to start our conversation in a bit of an untraditional way. You're back at work after undergoing treatment for thyroid cancer, a diagnosis that caught you by surprise. How are you feeling? Can you tell us a little bit about how it felt to go from interfacing with the healthcare system in terms of building with it to now interfacing with it in a completely different way?
Yeah, thanks for asking, first of all. I'm fortunate that thyroid cancer is not, as fatal as some of the other cancers that exist. And so I was never really I was never really felt like I was facing my mortality. But what I will say is that I got to appreciate firsthand the struggle that a cancer patient has, not in dealing with the healthcare system, but in sort of managing how it works for everyone around you, right? One of my close cousins, unfortunately, has been dealing with a much more serious cancer over the last 2 years. And so supporting her through it, I got to see firsthand how hard it was for her to be a patient. But I think the thing is, what I really enjoyed is getting to see how much my local community has stepped up. People that we didn't feel that close with were always checking in. And that's just been so wonderful. I wouldn't wish cancer on anyone, but I'm very grateful for what it's brought out in people that we're very close with. So.
Absolutely. Well, we're very happy to celebrate you being cancer-free. You've spoken a little bit about how you found meaning in your diagnosis. Can you share with our community what that means?
Yeah, I think, for a lot of people, you hear about how cancer forces you to reevaluate your priorities. I feel like my priorities are pretty good. I have family and work, they're fine. I think the one thing I would say is that there's a value, particularly in the South Asian community, for humility, right? And if you're blessed with gifts, you don't want to like flout them. And I think I've taken that so much to heart that sometimes I take the things that I have for granted. And for me, one of those things is music. I've been a lifelong musician. I was a singer.
In Pemmisola.
Yeah, a long time ago, and then I did my own music for a little while. And I think realizing that I might lose that gift with a surgery for my thyroid made me realize that there were so many things that by not enjoying, I was doing myself a disservice. So I ended up, flying across the country to do karaoke with my pen masala buddies and they humor me. And I threw a birthday party, which I hadn't done for a long time. When I turned 40, I hadn't done that. And I realized that sometimes celebrating your gifts is like a thing that we should do, and it's not immodest. And so, look to enjoy more, as opposed to always constantly focusing on what you can do better.
Absolutely. I love that too because I feel like a lot of these traditions are ones we lose because we feel like we've aged out of them.
Yeah.
Celebrating your birthday, going to karaoke with your friends. So it's nice that that was something you reinvested in
Yeah,
during this period of time.
definitely, definitely.
So I want to rewind a little bit before Octave and even before One Medical and your journey into healthcare. What were some of the early life experiences that shaped your interest in this industry?
Good question. So I think both my parents were programmers when I was growing up, and so they worked at Bell Labs, and so I got firsthand exposure to a lot of the things that were innovative back in the 90s. But what really excited me was the idea that innovation could improve people's lives. So ever since I was young, I was interested in entrepreneurship, but not just entrepreneurship to make a dollar, entrepreneurship because I felt like there was ways that we could fundamentally improve people's lives. And so, um, kind of getting the chance to be around a lot of innovation at an early age made me always want to do that. So I went to school at Wharton, but I was also an engineer and studied a program for engineering innovation. And so it was always kind of planted. But healthcare, ultimately, I didn't get interested in until I started working as an investor. So it was much later that I decided to pursue that as a career.
Super interesting. I mean, before even pursuing investing, you decided to become a consultant at Bain Company, which is honestly a fairly con- standard path for a lot of people coming out of college. It tends to provide this training and skill set, network, and resources that set people up for success later in life. Can you speak to that early career trajectory? Do you feel like you felt like this was a path you had to take, or you knew you were sort of trekking towards becoming an entrepreneur?
Oh, I have to say, in college, I was very focused on a lot of things, and one of them wasn't my career.
Right.
um,
I
I think,
appreciate the
I,
candor.
I mean, I was enjoying music. I was doing it on the side. I was trying to figure out if I should be doing that as a hobbyist or a career. And back then at Wharton, it was a lot more common for people to go into banking or consulting. And for whatever reason, it just resonated with me to work as a consultant to help companies, and finance didn't immediately kind of strike me. And so a lot of what I learned at Bain was like a few things. One, just how to be maniacal about culture. I feel like I still remember the values that Bain put in terms of being at cause, being results oriented, and these are things that informed the way I thought and broke down problems in a business world for a long time. But it wasn't necessarily that I woke up in the morning when I was 18 years old and was like, I'm definitely going to be a consultant in 4 years. Nothing like that. I'm fortunate to have found a company where I think the culture is really good and the intention around culture was really good. And I definitely drew on those lessons later. And I'd say like working as a consultant taught me how to break down hard problems. And I learned to use that in a lot of different ways in life.
Absolutely. After consulting and spending a bit of time in investing, you spent 5 years at One Medical, which is a tech-enabled primary care company that was focused on delivering high-quality, accessible care through insurance. What were some of the biggest takeaways from that experience?
So many things. So, the first thing just to rewind a little bit is I was interested in innovation in society, but when I was in business school, first of all, I'd already studied business, so it was like I was coming back, and what I found really interesting was market failure. Why is it the case that industries can sometimes create wealth and prosperity and sometimes continue to disappoint? And I knew this is a problem I was interested in at like a very academic level. As a matter of fact, when I graduated, um, HBS was like, "You should be a professor," and I decided not to go down that pathway.
Wow.
So then when I ended up working as an investor, I began to become interested in healthcare, and I was interested in the industry. But when I started working at One Medical, really applying a framework to fix market failure was what I learned. So Tom Lee is a visionary founder who I look up to. He's like my big brother mentor, even though he wouldn't say that. I would still
And
call.
tell us who Tom is.
So Dr. Tom Lee is the founder of One Medical. Prior to that, he founded Hippocrates when he was a student at Stanford. He is a doctor by training who also got a business degree and is a techno enthusiast who's very interested in a lot of different things. So cross-disciplinary interest and background and training, it's rare. It's a lot more common these days, but I would say he's all those things, plus he's a little bit of a renegade in the way he thinks about problems. So when he started One Medical, instead of figuring out how can I make my desired practice fit within the system, he said, how do I change the incentive structures so that I can deliver the care I want? And so he delivered this framework, and you're getting way more of an answer than you expected, but it's okay.
No, I love it.
He delivered a framework called value engineering that I learned how to use to think about how you fix systems. And that was one huge lesson, was how to think about that framework. And the second lesson is how to build a mission-oriented company. And I'd say it's one thing to work inside of a company that's a great culture like Bain & Co., but it's a whole nother thing to work inside of a company that's got a great culture and is focused on a problem that resonates with you deeply. And I mean, once you get hooked on that, it's hard to do anything else. And I think leaving investing, which was a lovely place with very, very smart people, one of the things I enjoyed about One Medical is I worked with people from all different walks of life and background, and it was so much more informal. Felt like I could be myself more authentically than I could in an investing landscape in a mind. And it felt like a natural evolution from everything I had done previously.
Absolutely. You mentioned how One Medical's mission resonated with you in a way that investing more broadly didn't. Healthcare touches everyone's lives, but was there a specific piece of that business that you felt like really spoke to you?
Yeah. Um, One, that you can deliver a healthcare experience that delights someone, right? And that can delight someone in their own needs. So drawing back to the cancer, the first clinician who found the cancer was my dentist. The
Yeah.
second was my primary care doctor. And the fact that I had 30 minutes to talk to her meant that at the end of my visit, I could talk about something that didn't seem like it was a big deal, which was the lump on my throat. So my point was, what resonated with me is that I had the opportunity to be part of a company that delivered people moments like that to other people. Like I remember sitting in an elevator in a building and someone coming up to me being like, "One Medical changed my life."
Wow.
And they tell you their story. And I remember going to the offsites and hearing about how we had to deliver AIDS and cancer diagnoses to people for the first time, and doing it with intention, doing it in a manner that supports the people that do it. I mean, what a great way to spend your time.
Absolutely. You've spoken extensively about how two of the top 5 conditions you saw while at One Medical were anxiety and depression. Can you tell us about how that started to plant the seed for Octave?
Yeah. Um, well, first of all, primary care, about 30% of the patients who come into primary care, sometimes you might hear as much as 50, are dealing with some sort of mental health need. Um, And what I observed was that we were encountering that need, but not exactly figuring out what to do with it. And we found that we couldn't find specialists to refer to, because anytime we found good specialists, they'd get too full. They wouldn't take specific conditions, and we just didn't want to invest, or we didn't have the ability to invest in the systems with the focus that you needed to. In fact, one of our physicians used to joke that if One Medical went into mental health, it'd become One Mental, because there was so much of a need. Um,
Wow.
and so uh, I encountered it pretty early, but really where it started to come to fruition was that the business that I oversaw was the direct employer business for One Medical, where we actually started setting up programs for employers, and every single one of the employers was asking for some support for mental health. And everything that I had learned from Tom about value engineering, about building companies, about figuring out ways to reduce waste in the system and reinvest it back into better experiences for all the stakeholders, I felt like it was the right time for me to apply to new industry, new vertical. And of course, like many, I had loved ones and personally experienced needs in the mental health world, and it was great to be able to provide that as well.
Yeah. Today, Octave's core mission is to deliver high quality behavioral health services in a way that are actually accessible to patients through insurance. Why is this such a difficult problem to solve in the US healthcare system?
Well, do you have 45 minutes? No. Okay. So the first is our mental health industry is underfunded. We under reimburse mental health professionals by about $6 billion. Professionals can make 30% more just charging cash and not dealing with insurance. So prior to about 5 or 6 years ago, most professionals in America were not even taking insurance. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it's very, very hard to determine what good looks like. Uh, so when you go to a surgeon, you can say, "What's your complication rate?" But it's very opaque to us what good looks like. And so, and then the last thing is, it's uh, it's a very hard matching problem, right? So when you go see a primary care doctor, you could probably see a primary care doctor for a wide variety of conditions, but a mental health provider might specialize in something different than what you have or what you need. And sometimes people don't exactly know what they need.
Yeah.
So when you combine those 3 or 4 things, what happens is 4 out of 10 patients quit in the first month of treatment. And it's not only hard to find a practitioner, but when you find a practitioner, you're not getting great help. And people say, "Hey, I'm just not right for therapy." Well, it's actually not true. One of the issues is that maybe there just wasn't enough work to make sure that you ended up with the right person. And that's one of the reasons it's so hard. And so what I love about that problem is it's hard. And it's not just about enabling a great product, it's figuring out how can you make the payer happy? How can you make the provider happy? All together, and so it's how do you fix a market failure at scale, and one that's meaningful for people. One of my closest friends, I observed firsthand struggle with alcoholism, and he was also a type 1 diabetic, and so him sort of not being able to successfully get into care over the course of about 7 years resulted in huge changes to his health. And so it's a mission that I see that's interesting academically, but personally I'm very passionate about.
Absolutely. And just goes to this whole point that behavioral health, mental health is inextricable from physical health.
Mhm.
It's interesting as you were talking because I started going to therapy a couple of years ago, and I remember as I was embarking upon this process to find a provider, the way so many of my friends described it to me was like dating.
Yeah.
They're like, it's not the same as going to a primary care doctor where, your hit rate, if you go to anyone, you'll probably figure out what the problem is, versus with finding someone like a therapist, it goes through a couple of iterations, and a lot of people quit, to your point, as a result, because they can't afford to go through those multiple matching processes to actually find the person that might be right for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so your experience and the experience of your friends is exactly what is happening right now. So
Absolutely.
a great problem to try to solve.
Yeah. Can you speak to how you're solving that tension with respect to affordability and accessibility for patients, where payers come in, and also sustainability for providers?
Yeah. So for patients, they care about flexibility, good fit, and affordability, right? So getting it covered by insurance is critical. And then within that, we vet the providers we bring on board. So only one of two providers who apply get an opportunity to work with Octave, and we screen for things that we think are baseline critical. And then we try to be thoughtful. So we allow people to self-book, but we also have a team of trained therapists whose only job is to match folks into care. And so they can be a little bit more conversational. What is it that you're here for? And try to be a little more open-ended in the way that they browse. The best way that you can get into care is to find a psychologist friend and ask, and just tell them what you want, let them interview and find someone. I want that experience to be how everyone gets care. To answer your question. But then in order to be able to do that, you need to convince the insurance company. So we went and worked with the insurance companies, and we said, hey, listen, we're going to measure whether people are getting better. And in exchange for demonstrating quality, we want higher reimbursement. Higher reimbursement allows us to then pay the providers more. And then guaranteeing demand and increasing wages for providers is how you create sustainability, which then allows you to keep providers in the system, which then allows you to then attract patients. So it can be a virtuous cycle if you do it correctly.
Yeah. Super interesting. I'm curious, what has been the biggest challenge in building this company?
A lot.
I'm sure there are many, but if you were to think of one specific one that you feel like has weighed on you considerably, or was something that you didn't expect.
Well, I did speak about this. I think the hardest part about being an entrepreneur is making decisions in the fog of uncertainty. I think when you are an executive, you don't have the ownership, stake, and stress that you do than when you're in the prime seat as a founder. And so what that means is it can often distort your thinking. And so I learned that managing my own emotions and my own thought process around decisions was the most critical way to make good decisions.
Wow.
And doing that, I learned that by making a lot of mistakes, by not handling uncertainty well. And then I realized over time what it looked like to handle uncertainty better. And I realized that you have to have a comfort with risk. And then I realized it's helpful for anything you do. So I'm grateful for the experience. I'm grateful for that exposure, but that's easily the hardest part about being an entrepreneur.
What were some of the practices you enacted in your life to solve for that?
A couple things. So first of all, I try not to arrive at, first of all, you can tell by how I talk that I work quickly. I try to work quickly, but when you make big decisions, you have to go slow. A lot of times the first answers that come to your mind aren't the right ones. So I sleep on any big decision. So I try to slow down. The second thing I try to do is create space between my identity and what I do for a living. I think that when you have balance, when you have hobbies, when you have things that that move you outside of work, you're able to more handle the work. There's all kinds of things that I think are really critical. I guess the only last one I would say is making sure you can clearly communicate why you do things for yourself and others, because I find in moments of difficulty, understanding why I do something gets me more fired up.
I love that. It's clear that this ethos has permeated your entire organization, just in that I think a lot of founders often like to, boast the merits of how much funding that they've raised, how many people that they've hired, et cetera, et cetera. But one of Octave's claims to fame is that it's consistently been a top-rated place to work by multiple institutions. How have you driven that culture?
I think actually so I got great advice along the way from a coach who I work with, and one of the things that she told me is you create your culture by how you treat your leadership team and how they interact with each other, because the people that you bring in and the manner in which you interact informs how they interact with other people. If you create a political environment on your leadership team, then everyone kind of cascades that across the organization. So I focused really especially after making mistakes along the way, I focused really hard on hiring a team that I felt was apolitical, was focused on the core mission, was smart, but and assertive, but not too aggressive. And then I tried to create a culture where we could openly disagree with each other, where we understood each other as humans, not just as workers. So one of the things that we do a check-in where we spend 15 minutes before we start every meeting and we talk about something random, like what's your favorite show growing up? And the point of that is over time, people get to know each other in a really related level, which I think is really hard in a virtual environment to establish. And then I'd say I try not to take myself too seriously. I try to create moments of fun for us. We have a Octave Olympics where we do rocks, paper, scissors, and we've had winners, and the winner gets a jacket, and it's the whole thing.
I love that.
But I generally feel like the role of culture is to, one, have people be able to authentically relate to you, and two, feel comfortable being their authentic selves. If you do those things, regardless of how you do those things, I think you're successful.
Yeah. In the current zeitgeist, organizations are increasingly being knocked for having cultures like these and what people like to label soft culture. How are you navigating those challenges of we want to make this an authentic space where you can show up and be yourself at work, have it be an apolitical environment, but there's also work that has to get done. And candidly, there are people that you hire that aren't going to be a perfect fit with the organization.
Totally. I think, and I was just speaking with someone about this because after I gave this talk recently, someone was coming up to me and asking me about this. I think that being kind doesn't mean you have to forego your goals. Remember, I'm still a Bain at heart, results focused. We have OKRs as an organization. Every single person needs to know what their roles and responsibilities are. Every single person needs to know what their OKRs are so that they are held accountable, right? But what I find happens is people sometimes vacillate between being emotionally triggered and aggressive, right? Or being pushovers. And I think that there's a middle ground called being kind but assertive, right? And if you just because you are open and you're available doesn't mean we're spending an entire meeting, you know, relating our feelings. We're actually just getting to know each other, and then we're getting to the work, right? So I don't think it has to be a trade-off. Frankly, I think a high-performing culture is one in which people are trusted and feel trusted, and then drive to the work. I think there's leaders who do it differently, but I personally like to inspire people based on possibility, not on fear.
I love that. There's this phrase we've been learning in the MBA program around a top diplomat who served many years ago about this balance between charm and steel, which I feel like encapsulates what you're saying. I wanna harken back to.
By the way, can I say?
Yeah.
Anytime I am going to shift into steel mode, I remind people that I'm from New Jersey. Like, I am from New Jersey, and so you should know I'm going to be direct right now. And so, anyway, everyone has different ways to let the steel out, but sometimes you got to tell people what's what.
Yeah, I love that. It's just it's a way to prepare them almost.
Yeah.
And I love that New Jersey is the signal.
I don't know why. You got to give New Jersey. We're direct. We're direct people.
At some point, we're gonna have to run a study on how many people who've been on this podcast are from New Jersey.
It's a lot. East South Asians from New Jersey. It was the first place we stopped. We're very grateful to the home state.
And that's a special place.
Yeah.
I want to track back to your time at Bain, your time as an investor, because I imagine it's shaped you a ton as a founder. I mean, you worked as an investor at Insight, Bain Capital. These are organizations that have hallowed reputations in the world of investing. What were you trying to take from these places? What are some of the things you also shed in leaving them?
Ooh, great questions. Okay. So I told you about Bain. Insight allowed me to get exposed to a lot of growth stage companies. And I think the number one thing I learned is that early founders don't scale themselves because they try to do too much themselves. And they don't reevaluate their company every 6 months. And so I saw many case studies of that, and that was super helpful. And a great team, and I've learned a lot from those people. I'm not a pure technology entrepreneur, so there was less of that. And by the way, technology in 2006 is irrelevant to today. So, but which again, I'm old, sorry. But I think at Bain Capital, two or three things. One, I think we all think private equity is, there's some misconceptions about, or appropriate conceptions in some instances about private equity's relationship with greed. But what I enjoyed about the partners at Bain Capital was they had a lot of integrity. There were businesses that they walked away from because they felt that they weren't ethical.
Wow.
It is the sharpest peer group I've been around ever. People were smart, just not just in ways that you'd expect. People had written books. People had been the general managers of the Red Sox. Like, people have interests that were very, very varied. But I think they were very, very good at breaking down businesses quickly and thinking like owners. So I think I had learned strategy, but Bain Capital was where I learned how to really understand industries. And then Bain Capital was really how I started to get a framework for healthcare, which I've obviously perfected, but it really helped me understand how to think about healthcare.
And what were some of the things you shed?
Ooh, well, I think the folks at Bain Capital would admit that it is a very culturally New England organization where you feel pressure to talk and act a certain way. And being at One Medical allowed me to realize that as a South Asian, I could just be my authentic self and not hide it, I would say. So, like, I think a little bit more authenticity and not trying to emulate was kind of what I needed to shed when I left Bain Capital. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, like about the complexity of operating as people, and there was a lot I didn't understand when I was on the investment side of the table.
Totally. A conversation in this realm that tends to come up a lot on the podcast and among the founders and leaders in our network is around raising capital. And you had a unique vantage point, having come from the world that doled out capital. Can you speak to how that shaped your approach to fundraising at Octave?
Well, I will say that it provided an advantage. Having had been all the places that I had been, I knew people socially who trusted me. But with that said, one of the things that by the time I had to raise capital, I realized is I knew that I never wanted to be an entrepreneur who pitched a vision I couldn't achieve. And so I think there are a lot of people who get great outcomes from their rounds because they get high valuations and lots of dollars. But I've been inside companies, and I've been on the opposite side of companies that raise too much and put themselves through needless stress trying to chase something that's unrealistic. And so I think I got great outcomes. I think all my investors are going to do very well, but I feel good in that I didn't overpromise. Even though, certainly I was ambitious, I don't feel like I overpromised to investors, and I was able to accept lesser results from the perspective of the pricing and give away more of the company, but I was willing to do that because I wanted to make sure I could deliver for my investors.
Yeah. The market is obviously less frothy right now than it was even 2 to 5 years ago. And I'm curious what your take on leadership is in the current moment, especially as we consider perspectives on healthcare, the transformation that the industry and we're going through as a society, and the broader geopolitical atmosphere, and also in the context of the recent murder of Brian Thompson.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot.
There's a lot in there. I'm sorry, it's a big question.
So leadership today, how does it change in leadership? Okay.
In what you observed as an investor, even when you started this company in 2018.
Well, I always felt like I was kind of holding my breath through the frothy times because I was like, I don't see how this ends well. So I think things are a little more rational. I think it used to be the case that we would celebrate the entrepreneur who had the ego and ambition to promise a lot and then scale massive teams beyond the actual product market fit. And I think leadership today requires greater discipline. Leadership today requires greater financial discipline. Leadership today requires greater strategic discipline. And I think that's okay. That's how better companies are built. I think there's probably an over rotation towards this idea that digital health can't create venture scale companies. And that's wrong. I think there's been a generation of companies that grew without capital, financial, and strategic discipline. And now there are a whole bunch of companies that are growing with capital, financial, and strategic discipline who are going to go public in the next 3 to 5 years and showcase the fact that it is possible to create value and returns long haul. And then to the last piece on the murder of Brian Thompson, I would say that in some ways, my belief is that business leaders are unfortunately pawns in a system that is not built correctly. I understand the underlying sentiment of anger towards individual leaders, but everything I've heard of Brian Thompson, he's a very high integrity person. I think that the immediate reaction that some of the more institutional and powerful people have is to retreat. And I know of executives who have full-time bodyguards as a result of this, and I feel awful for them and their families. And I also understand why there's so much anger. And so I think that the anger should be directed towards answers. The anger should be directed towards how can we appropriately create a system of checks and balances for large payers. I don't think we're in a moment of sobriety right now, but I think that things come in waves. So right now we have this massive political movement towards dismantling the government as an operator. I think the counter reaction is going to occur. And the question is, when that occurs, are we going to be thoughtful about it? Are we going to be better than administrations in the past? I think that the level of change that needs to occur cannot occur due to business leaders. We can blame business leaders, but the reality is we need a better framework for them to operate in. You know that I'm passionate about market failure. You asked me a market failure question. I'm going to take it.
Yes.
All right.
I love it.
And so all I will say is Brian Thompson is a scapegoat. We're, as a society, very good at scapegoating. But what we need is thoughtful changes to policy. And we're not going to get them now. We're not going to give them in 5 years, but maybe 10 to 15 we can if we start now.
I love that. All that in mind, what's the vision for Octave? IPO, exit?
I don't define the vision for Octave as an outcome financially, but Octave is going to focus on creating a mental health marketplace that prioritizes quality. I care about a world in which your average practitioner is inspired to do good work because they are seen and they're rewarded and they're paid more and they see more patients, and that it's easier for patients to navigate care. And we're actually working on a product called Connect. Quick commercial break. Connect is an opportunity, is our attempt to take the things that we've learned from operating as a practice and create technology that allows insurance companies to operate more effective mental health markets. That is where we're headed next. Whether that's IPO'd or bought or I don't know, but I just know that I'm very enthusiastic about the problem we're solving, and I'm going to stay enthusiastic about that problem.
I love that. As a South Asian founder, how has your identity shaped your approach to mental health, the stigma, care delivery? And I'm curious if you've noticed any shift in our community's evolution with respect to this work.
Well, I'd say the younger South Asians have a very similar pattern of having a lot less stigma around it. Stigma in the South Asian community is interesting, but what I actually find more interesting is the manner in which being a South Asian has helped me navigate mental health challenges. So I'm Hindu. My parents took me to the ashram when I was a kid, and we'd read the Bhagavad Gita. A lot of the things that I learned about equanimity got me through tough times.
Yeah.
So I think that we have a spiritual tradition that actually can be quite helpful for people navigating their mental health challenges. And I mean, the stigma of the elder generation is the stigma of the elder generation. I think our generation, like we're in the same generation, but our generation is a lot more with it, and I'm glad for that.
Me too. You spoke to how some of those spiritual practices that you learned even at a young age have helped you through moments that you've gone through in your adult life. Can you speak to some of those moments of doubt and challenges, whether it's in your professional or personal journey?
Yeah. So there's a verse in, if I may, there's a verse in the Gita that speaks to accepting the result and the opposite result as blessing. And there are moments in my career where I know I'm trying to do good, but people perceive that I'm something I'm not. I spoke to a moment when we had a difficult employee culture that was toxic, and I felt that I was doing things for the right reason, but people really questioned my motives. And I realized that the best thing I could do was control how I showed up. I can't control how people perceive me. And I think that's sort of been one of the largest takeaways. And then you find that once you release your anxiety about your perception of the outcomes, you're able to move faster on things. And I do that personally and professionally. That's how I handled my cancer diagnosis. I didn't lose a night of sleep on the cancer diagnosis. Woo! It wasn't a big deal. I was like, you know what?
Wow.
At the end of the day, it is what it is. I'm gonna like do what I can do, and I'll move on. Now, I will say, if my kids had to face that, it would probably be a lot harder. But I would say it's been very helpful. And obviously, having been raised a Hindu, I certainly meditate, and I use that to try to rebalance myself.
Yeah. Before we sat down, you mentioned how being here in Philadelphia, close to Wharton's campus, feels like a full circle moment because this is where you first started hatching ideas as a college student. Can you speak to the young budding entrepreneurs out there who might be sitting on an idea but just don't know if they can start, aren't sure, don't know how to take that leap? What advice do you have for them? What advice do you have for the younger version of yourself who is, sitting here not just a couple blocks away?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I will say that when I was a college student, I wasn't doing much hatching. I was more doing a lot of mischief. But when my wife was in business school and I was here maybe about 12 years ago, I certainly was. And the advice I'd give to a person is, you know, thinking is overrated, right? So, not that you shouldn't be thoughtful about your strategy, or you shouldn't try to make sure you've got a good business plan, but a lot of times we overplay what we know, right? And if you feel passionate about something, then just get started. If you feel moved by something, then just try, and you can always go back. So I would encourage that person to spend less time creating analytical certainty and more time testing.
I'm going to take that one step further. Sometimes I think people want to start, but they don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
What are some of those actionable steps you recommend people take today?
So I can't, I'll give you an example of what I would do. A lightweight version of your product and test it.
Okay.
So instead, let's say you wanna, I don't know, I remember when I was in college, we wanted to build like a security system for kids, like tagging. And, one of our friends just went out and he tested whether parents would be interested, right? Or he tried to figure out whether he could actually build the thing. Um, you know, you could make a business plan and do market research, or you could try to figure out what the most critical thing is to figure out and then just go get in front of people. So when I started Octave, I had a lot of views on whether people would like group classes. So the thing that I would have done right away is do a virtual group class tomorrow. Like set one up and see what happens and see what it's like. So the quicker you can get in the lab testing an idea, and the quicker you figure out what is critical path and then test that, the better. And there's always ways that you can do it cheap and low cost before you go raise. Because once you raise, you're committing, right? Once you go ask people for money, you're committing to them that you're going to be successful. So try to do as much as you can on your own.
Yeah. I love this because it's so clear your mind works a million miles a minute, but you've also taken the time to deeply reflect. You've spoken about how you haven't made this company and being a founder your entire identity. You've been able to figure out who you are as an individual and who you are as a leader. What are some of your hacks for budding founders, just given the current conversation where it feels like hustle culture is really prioritized? You should be working those 90 to 100-hour weeks if you want to make this idea work.
Yeah. I think that, and I'm not giving you new stuff. I'm just going to tell you the stuff that I've heard that is helpful, which is within your day, having moments of break. I have a couple hours a day where I'm with my kids and I'm not by my phone. Micro rest. Getting space within your week where you're doing something. And removing yourself of this idea that it's zero sum. I find that exercising makes me more emotionally fit because, man, you last night, some VC that you really wanted to attract, to invest in, you just said no. And you just had this whole vision for how you're going to work. And then you got to get up the next day. Then you lift something, or you run and you sweat and you do something that you didn't think you were capable of. Well, that belief transfers, right? So making space for something that isn't your core actually can help you reset your nervous system. And then I would just say it's not that you can just get away with working less. You have to work more efficiently too. So in the space that you are, just relentlessly challenging yourself of, do I need to be working on this, or is there a better way, a more efficient way you can do it? I think it's those couple things. It's rest, it's resetting, and it's figuring out ways to use your hobbies to reinvigorate you. And then it's just making sure you're relentlessly efficient.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
The last question I have for you is you've been building in public. People have seen your work. They know the work that Octave has done. What's something that people don't know about you and wouldn't know about you just looking at what you've put into the universe thus far?
I'm very absent-minded. Okay. Like, my college friends, my dad used to call me the absent-minded professor. My college friends sometimes wonder how I function. I think there's somewhat of a few of the creative people I know can sometimes be space cadets, so I can be high functioning and very low functioning, but it's okay. I think the way I've learned as a younger child is to be silly. That's maybe a couple things that I would say. We all have our imperfections. People tend to think that just because someone's done X, they must be able to do a lot of there's a lot of things I'm not very handy around. I could tell you a whole list. My wife could give you a whole list of things that I can't do very well. But those are a couple. I like being silly with the kids, and with adults too. But yeah, those are probably two things.
I love that, and I have to say I've never felt more seen, both as someone, building a company, but also as a younger child.
Yeah.
I lied. I do have one last question for you. You've been through so much in the realm of professional success, personal troughs. How do you define success?
Oh, that's a good question. So for me, I feel successful when I feel like I'm doing things from a place of freedom. Like, if I'm motivated by the things that I'm doing every day, I feel successful. If I feel like I'm doing things that I enjoy because I want to, not because I have to, I feel successful. In that sense, I feel like I've gotten more successful, and not necessarily by the conventional means, although certainly we've done well. It's primarily because I think that the more free I feel to do and create what I find interesting, the more exciting life is.
I love that. Sandeep, thank you so much for joining me on South Asian Trailblazers.
Thank you for having me.
Such an honor. So excited to see you keep building Octave and all the work that you put out there. It's just so refreshing to hear that the perspectives that you have and the journey that you've been on thus far.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you'll join our community at southasiantrailblazers.com. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter and follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and any major platform. Here at South Asian Trailblazers, we're dedicated to elevating leading South Asians. Until next time.